Hello, welcome to another video. In this video, I will show you my 8 favorite techniques to paint feathers with watercolors. The methods I will show you today make painting feathers really easy and fun. Once the background is dry, we can start with feather technique number 1. I will wetten the body of the bird and then drop in the watercolor. Here I'm using cadmium orange, cadmium red deep and some burnt umber for the shadows. As you can see in the reference photo, the feathers on the body have different colors and are placed in distinctive patterns. The pattern almost looks like there is a ring or a belt around the bird. My placement of the watercolor needs to reflect this pattern. I'm also making use of the white paper, letting it shine through. This will increase the contrast, making the red and orange color appear even more intense. Adding a section with color gradients is a great way to suggest feathers without adding too much detail. The only details you really need to get right are the overall colors and the patterns, like the ring pattern around the bird. I add some orange watercolor to the head area and let it bleed out softly on the wet paper. The orange will be a great underpainting for the black watercolor, which I will use for the head later. I can let the orange shine through. Some of the next feather techniques I will show you do require an underwash. I mix a lot of water with the smallest amount of lamp black to create the lightest wash of grey. I'm using the wet and wet method to add the light wash to the wing feathers and the tail feathers. I leave out some of the black feathers on the wing. I will show you soon how I'm going to use white paper as highlights to create a larger contrast. Let's get to work on feather technique number 2. I pre-wetten the head and apply a light wash of lamp black watercolor. Now I can drop in some more black pigment, letting it bleed. I'm using a smaller brush because water control is key here. You need to know at all times how much water you have soaked up in your brush. If there is too much water in your brush and too much is released onto the paper, you can soak it up with a paper towel immediately. Be aware that black watercolor does stain the paper, so you will never be able to remove it completely. The pre-wetted area should only cover an area slightly bigger than the black area you see in the reference photo. The watercolor will bleed no further than the waterline, creating a transition to the orange body. Since the water dries faster at the edges appear to have a really cool pattern. This transition to the orange body looks really great. The torn edge looks like darker feathers laying on top of lighter feathers of the body. You cannot see this edge immediately while you paint, as it appears while the watercolor is drying at an uneven rate. The watercolor I drop in now is the perfect underpainting for more details, which I will add later. The difference to the technique I used for the body is the edge from the waterline and the amount of detail I add. I want the eye to focus on the head, and this is why adding detail here is worth it. Let's move on to technique number 3. This time I'm working wet on dry for the wing feathers. I'm working on the feathers in the middle only. When painting these feathers, I paint the shadows of the overlaying feathers. I add black watercolor to the shaded area. Then I clean my brush and add some clean water to the rest of the feather, allowing the black watercolor to bleed into that area. I do use my clean and dried off brush as a sponge to soak up some of the water. Like I said before, the black watercolor does stain the page. The wing feathers had a few minutes to dry. They are dry to the touch. This is the perfect time to lift pigment. When you wait too long, it will be harder to lift any pigment. I use an old damp brush to rub over the paper, softening the pigment, and then soak it up with a paper towel. I'm making use of the staining properties of the lamp black to paint in these feathers. There is a straight line dividing each feather, and the tip of the feather is lighter. I found this is the easiest method to paint these feathers, as they will still look like they were painted in one go. After a few minutes of drying time, I'm darkening the shadows of these feathers again. These feathers just look so interesting. The fourth technique I'm showing you is called negative painting. I'm mixing a very light wash of lamp black to paint in the shadows of the feathers. To paint in these shadows, I apply the light wash to the paper and use a damp brush to soften the hard edges. This method gives you greater control over where the watercolor can bleed to. This painting does not require so many feathers, as I only suggest them in this area. I wanted to show you the process, so I added them anyways. For the fifth technique, I'm intentionally using a very small brush, which can hold barely any water. The watercolor I'm using here has more pigment in it, just to make it darker. Just like with the previous methods, I'm applying watercolor to the paper to paint in the shadows, and then I'm using a damp brush to soften the edges. The difference here is that I'm working with an almost dry brush and leave the tip of the feathers white. The white space will increase the contrast and make the painting more expressive. Of course, every feather is painted a little different, just like in nature. When working with an almost dry brush, the watercolor will not flow across the paper. This leaves white spots behind. I'm using those white spots to add structure to the paper and to the feather. If you're using a paper that is structured and not flat, the watercolor pigment will only stick to those areas that the brush touches. So, when using a dry brush, the brush will only touch the bits of paper that stick up, leaving an interesting wash of watercolor. While this method looks like a lot of work and very time consuming, it actually is not, as I'm only painting a small portion of the feathers like this. For the sixth technique, I'm once again working with an almost dry brush. This time I'm not painting in the shadows. I'm using the almost dry brush to add structure to the tail feathers. Every brush stroke must follow the direction from the root of the feather to the outer tip, as these brush strokes will be visible in the final painting. In the beginning, there is slightly more pigment in the brush. I start at the outer edge of the feather because this is the darkest area. The underside of some of the feathers is visible, and I can use this chance to darken them. I will probably add a second layer once this one is dry. For the seventh technique, I'm suggesting feathers to create depth. The feathers I added to the top of the wing were painted using a similar method, but not quite the same. Let me explain what makes these feathers so different. These feathers serve a different purpose. They separate the body parts and show depth. They reflect the roundness of the object. Unlike the light gray feathers at the top, They are a structural element rather than a decorative one. Their positioning and shape is different. One feather I add to the painting here can represent a cluster of feathers, just like a curl on a human hair that is made up from many hairs. These feathers are, unlike the feathers on the top area of the wing, not painted in to create feathers, but to separate the sections of the body. I add a light wash of watercolor to the paper and then soften it with a damp brush. This time the brush is a little more wet, allowing the watercolor to bleed out further. With this technique, I'm not painting the shadow one feather at a time. I'm painting a cluster of feathers by painting the cluster's shadow. The 8th technique I want to show you are the streak details representing feathers. Adding these details is so important in order to draw the eye to just the right areas and can really change the look of any painting. The streaks I add to the head are really dark. I re-wetten an area of the head and add lamp black. Then I can draw the wet watercolor out into streaks. Or I can wait for it to dry and add the streaks on top of the darkened area as another layer. When the streaks came out too harsh or dark, I can soften them with a damp brush. I add some small and really light streaks to suggest feathers. I only add a few in patches, as adding too many would look overwhelming and draw too much attention to them. I hope this video helped you. So please hit the like button and subscribe for more fun videos. Let me know in the comments below which of these techniques you have used in the past, and let me know if you know any more techniques. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with the next video.